Some monsters spend their days hoarding gold. Others are content to just skulk around in tombs, waiting for a hapless adventurer to stumble in. But the Kuo-toa? Oh, the Kuo-toa are on an entirely different level of ambition. They're so wonderfully, so brilliantly, so terrifyingly unhinged that they can literally dream a brand new god into existence. And one is brewing right now. Imagine this. Deep below the surface world, in a half-sunken cyclopean ruin they have christened the Broken Garden, a congregation of 43 frantic Kuo-toa priests is gathered. And they're not praying in silent reverence. They are knitting their shared collective madness into a physical form. And the object of their affection is the broken mosaic at the bottom of that ruined garden. Hello adventurers, and welcome back to the Red Quills. My name is Ryan, and today we are going to continue on this November map making challenge for day 8 with the Broken Garden. Thank you once again for joining me on this cartographic adventure that we are embarking on. Today we're going to be making another dungeon. Yesterday we did the Hollow Crown, which was a much more broad viewpoint as to how an archpriest would consider creating a rebellion and occupying a certain fortress, and how you can gauge that fortress to have different kinds of challenges for your players. But today we're going to go much more detailed in a survey of the Broken Garden. We're going to be talking about the Kuo-toa as monsters and NPCs. But before we do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out my A4 sheet of paper. I'm going to get out my list of fine lighter pens. Everything's in the material list below. And we're going to start sketching out, as I talk, a little bit more about these fish-headed people. To understand the Kuo-toa, you have to understand that, according to the lore, they didn't really start this way. Once upon a time, untold ages ago, they were a regular surface-dwelling people living along the coastlines, and they built communities, and they fished, and they watched the tides. And then, of course, the stories differ. But generally speaking, one of the more popular stories is that the Mind Flayers came, tortured them in their underdark communities for centuries and generations upon generations, until they were so maddened and despited by the tortures that their minds broke. And they found that they had a new power, the one to call upon and create whatever object of their worship they desired. But the problem is that when an entire species is suffering from a collective inherited psychosis, the gods that pop out of their shared hallucinations are eccentric, to say the least. Take their most famous deity, Blibdoolpool, the Sea Mother. Her origin story isn't some grand cosmic epic. She began as a busted statue that someone's ancestor found, probably washed up on a subterranean sea, with a human figure and a lobster's head and claws crudely stuck onto it, and that's it. But generation after generation of Kuo-toa stared at it, feared it, and worshipped it. That collective belief, that focused psychic energy, made the Kuo-toa much more of a dangerous entity than they would ever have been without that power. So that's what we're exploring today. When we create this lair, we're not just going to be dealing with the Kuo-toa as their simple stat blocks, because let's be honest, they're fairly boring. They have a couple of interesting tricks. I, for one, could wax lyrical about the use of nets in combat in D&D and how they are underutilized at many tables. But if you only take the stat blocks and you don't consider their ability to create gods, then yeah, they're not going to be much of a problem. However, they can provide a much more metaphysical threat to even a high-level party. Killing them isn't the problem. It's their dying prayers that is the problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to create the Broken Garden. The first thing that we need to do is, of course, figure out what the ruin looks like once upon a time. Now, I'm basing it here on the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The idea is that they were built on what became a swampland over millennia and sank beneath the sea. And as it did so, the internal caverns became filled with water. So as we create this, we're also going to think in terms of the stages and the different challenges that we're providing for our players. And the first one is getting to the ruin and showing them signs that there is an inhabitant population here. So we're going to have the topside village, and that's where the Kuo-toa inhabit on the surface. That's where you can find signs that they live there, but that's also where they keep the goods that they want to trade with the outside world and the traps to deter not only, bestial predators, but also adventurers who are looking a little bit too closely into Kuo-toa affairs. Now, in some of my previous videos, people have taken umbrage with the concept that a, intelligence 7 goblin has managed to create a complex trap that will kill even a high level player, because they think that, that means that they are stupider at everything than, an intelligence 10 commoner. But I will point out that that isn't a problem here, because the average intelligence of a Kuo-toa is 11, which means they're actually slightly more intelligent than the average human, and we can use that to our advantage. So when you're creating the topside village, if you want to have signs of who they are facing, perhaps defaced statues to give them a bit more context about the powers of the Kuo-toa, their odd form of worship, their religious-centric society, then that's the place to do it. And it is an option for them as well, not only to find some traps and do some investigation, but to rest and prepare, because the next step goes underwater. Now, if you as a DM haven't used water as an obstacle in your encounters thus far, then I absolutely would recommend it. The rules for underwater combat are very, very clear, and they make things very easy. For instance, fire is only half as effective when used in magic. You can't really use range attacks, disadvantage, and anything without a swimming speed is going to have problems. So that gives us the first issue. If you've got a wizard with a water breathing spell or a potion that can help you, then that's hunky-dory, but that doesn't mean that you're still going to be comfortable fighting an aquatic predator. We've already talked about a couple of aquatic creatures in the past, the aboleth being most interesting of them. But here I think it would be fun if you conjured up perhaps some more intelligent versions of marine animals, or even some lesser deities that they've involved into their pantheons. In which case, if you did want to bring an aboleth in, then that would make sense too. Once they've swum around and they found more iconography and they understand a little bit more about the environment, they've seen the shape of the pyramid or the garden as a whole, then they can find the entrance to the doorway and they can head into what was once the internal herbery of the garden. So if the garden was an ancient tiered pyramid with, the channels of water flowing down the sides and the stairways and the trees growing on the outsides, then the interior would be more of like a greenhouse lit by magic. And so that's what they're going to be swimming into now. But now, of course, it's filled with the plants that find that aquatic environment to be much more helpful. But I think it would be interesting as well to start laying in traps that are indicative of the problems that the Kuo-toa can present to the players. So if I labeled this as being a trap or a tactical combat, it's because the Kuo-toa have lived here for so long that they believe that this place has a personality all of its own. And any of us who have lived in an old house will understand that. The idea that each house has its own, household deity or even a ghost inhabiting it is not uncommon. And if the Kuo-toa, who can dream these things up and give them powers, believe the same thing over generations, then this place does indeed have a personality. The next optional area is behind a hidden door. It's the spawning pools, and here again is the option for you to explore those secondary powers of the Kuo-toa. If you give the children the same stat blocks as the adults, but have them, when panicking, create lair actions, toxic environments, pools of poison, whirlwinds of air beneath the surface of the water, all of those chaotic, wild magics of their undirected belief, then that's an option for you to explore there as well. And then finally, they have to swim once again through the submerged tunnel. I think it would be fun to make it very, very thin so that you have, a combination of difficult terrain and underwater movement and, any gripping vines or underwater predators or leeches or poison in the water to make this more difficult before you even get to them. You're having a lot of difficulties without even presenting them with an enemy that has a stat block, which is a challenge to your players. And that's what we want to get them thinking about. The challenge with the Kuo-toa is not the stat block, it is not the abilities, it's not the weapons, it is the lore of the Kuo-toa, which is why they deserve the 3 full pages in the monster manual. And then finally we get to the altar, which was once, the center of one of the main pyramids in the Broken Gardens. It has the altar upon it, it has the mosaics there, and that's where the ceremony takes place. And there are the 43 gathered Kuo-toa priests. They're trying to, secure a ritual. And they will fight and they will die for their misformed god, safe in the knowledge that if they do die in service of the god, then it will revive them for them to fight for it once more. And again, here we come to another option for the powers of the Kuo-toa. If they fully believe that they are immortal in the service of this deity, then that is something that you can bring into the fore as well. But if you do want to provide what is more of a tactical challenge and less of a metaphysical challenge, then having them summon a Tarrasque isn't outside of their powers. So here's some options for making the combat a little bit more difficult. Here's some options for making the water more difficult to navigate through. And so to really dial up the danger, here's some extra rules that you can spring on them. Firstly, you could have some electrified water. Any lightning-based spell or effect that hits a target in the water deals its damage to them, and then half that damage to everyone, friend or foe, within 10 feet, including the caster. It's not strictly speaking in the rules, but I've kind of always wondered, why not, you know? And remember that the psychic pressure here from generations of Kuo-toa living here is immense. Each hour the players spend in the temple, you can force them to make a wisdom save. And on a failure, they suffer a bout of short-term madness, convinced that the walls are breathing or their own blood is turning to seawater. Even if they pass, you can still hear the Kuo-toa's prayers whispered in the back of their minds in their own voices. When you get to the ritual, remember it's not a simple boss fight. In order to stop the ritual, you need to present them with several options here, because just wandering in and fighting the god is only going to increase the belief that the Kuo-toa have. It's only going to increase their desperation and their madness. It's only going to empower them, really. So you got to think about the different ways in which they can stop the ritual and banish the god. Because the Kuo-toa, in all their fish-headed glory, they teach us one of the most vital lessons in this game, that the sharpest, most reality-altering weapon isn't a Vorpal sword or a staff of the Magi. It is belief. The Kuo-toa are rule of cool incarnate. They can do what they believe they can do, and I think that that's very, very fun. If you have rule of cool at your table, if you explore that thing, then this is your option to extend that to the NPCs as well. Even if you don't, then you have to acknowledge that the Kuo-toa's ability to create gods gives them powers beyond the mere stat blocks, and you need to figure out what those are beforehand. So I hope that you enjoyed this take on the Broken Garden. If you are enjoying these videos so far, if you're thinking that I'm doing quite well in my descent into Mantis on day 8 of this map making challenge, then please like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below to encourage me to continue further, and I will give you the challenge for tomorrow. What are we doing tomorrow? Yes, so it has come to my attention, many of you have noted, not just on here, but on the Discord and on the social medias, that I haven't actually made a map of the section of the world that I selected of Recwild. I haven't made a map of Anakos yet, and that's for very good reason. What I intend to do is make a map of a lot of individual points, and then at the end make a very big detailed map of the landscape, because it's not going to take me very long. Let's be honest, I do this all the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the small stuff first and then make the big map later on. And that means that yes, I'm not going to make a realm map very early. But in order to assuage your interest, what I'm going to do is tomorrow I'm going to make a map of ancient Anakos. So the challenge tomorrow is to make a map of your world, or the portion of the world that you run your D&D campaigns in, several hundred, if not thousands of years ago. I'm going to weather mine. I'm going to use a combination of paints and ink to show that. So that's your challenge. And I will join you tomorrow to talk about some tips and tricks and talk about adding some prophecies to your maps as well, because that's the challenge that I'm creating for myself. So I will see you tomorrow for that addition to the November Map Making Challenge. Thank you for joining me, and of course, happy mapping. Take their most famous deity, Blibdoolpoop. Blibdoolpoop. Yeah, I always forget how to pronounce that. Blibdoolpoop. Take their most famous deity, Blibdoolpoop. Take their most famous deity, Blibdoolpoop, the Sea Mother.